In 1944, the residents of Mattoon, Illinois, were plagued by a string of gaseous attacks from a phantom assailant in questionable clothing. While soldiers were away at war, the residents of a small town in Illinois were attacked by an individual whose existence is debatable. On the 1st of September 1944, Mrs. Kearney and her daughter were partially paralyzed by what she described as a sweet-smelling, sickening odor. She said that the gas was pumped in through her bedroom window, and soon after perceiving the odor, she tried to move and couldn't get up from her bed. Luckily, her sister was around at the time, and she ran to the neighbor's house and called the police. After a thorough search, the police did not find the culprit or any sign of the mysterious gas. The next day, the front page of the Mattoon Journal-Gazette read, "An aesthetic prowler on loose." The headline sent a wave of panic through the small town of Mattoon. It was World War II, and they had heard numerous stories of the Nazi nerve gas and its disastrous effects, and this possibility set the townspeople on edge. As you would expect, the gentle town of Mattoon experienced dozens of gas attacks over the following weeks. There were reports of stomach aches, vomiting, dizziness, and paralysis occurring after inhaling a sickly sweet odor. On September 5th, Mrs. Corday noticed what resembled a handkerchief on her porch and decided to investigate. Within seconds of inhaling the contents of the cloth, her face and throat began to swell, and her legs became paralyzed. What I really want to know is if you find a strange rag on your porch, are you just going to pick it up and start sniffing it? Anyway, she began to spit blood, and her husband had to call the physician. The account was given by Mrs. Corday to the news, and it was yet another major report of the gasser, and the Journal-Gazette was on top of the story and every other story that was remotely related to the gassings, and soon the stories made their way up to Chicago, where the Herald American wrote a piece on the happenings in Mattoon. This made the issue a national incident, and theories of the mad gasser made its way across America. The newspapers were very thorough in their reports of the gasser. All 17 attacks were carefully documented and reported, and this continual update created an atmosphere of dread in the small town. People no longer felt safe in their homes. The mad gasser was always lurking close to their windows. It did not help that the 10-man task force and the FBI that were on the case were drawing blanks. They had come up with no solid lead, and their only suspect had a solid alibi. The handkerchief found on Mrs. Corday's porch had no trace of any chemical substance with that level of damage, and the police reports that came in described the gasser. Most reports described a tall figure dressed in black, carrying a pump with the handle of a flit gun. So the next conclusion was fairly obvious. Farley Quellen was the main suspect. He possessed an outstanding knowledge of chemistry and was shunned by the town. It was observed that he had the motive and means to carry out the attacks. He was, however, not the culprit. His name was soon cleared as he was under surveillance when some of the attacks occurred. He was the obvious suspect, yes, but he was not the gasser. The families of Mattoon resolved to take matters into their own hands. The police and state couldn't keep them safe. They banded together with guns and charged into the night, determined to bring this phantom gasser to justice. The police had to shut several makeshift vigilante cells down to maintain order. Eventually, the police stopped charging in with full force after every call. After the first week, the calls were mostly false alarms, and they received less and less attention from the police. Eventually, all calls concerning the gasser were placed on low priority, and investigations into the mad gasser were scaled down and eventually halted. And not long after the halt, the police announced that the town was suffering from mass hysteria. This, of course, sounded ludicrous to the townspeople, and they refused to believe that the phantom menace that plagued them for weeks with nocturnal gases was merely a figment of Mrs. Jones' imagination. With time, the residents forgot about the menace and the reports died down, and, of course, they eventually stopped. The idea of hysteria had its appeal. It would mean that there was never a masked assailant with a flit gun, and they were simply under the spell of an overzealous news reporter. There were no suspects, nor were there any concrete evidence linking suspects to a crime. Several experts gave their opinions on the matter, and they came up with varying conclusions. Now, Professor D.M. Johnson, a psychologist at the University of Illinois, believes that the symptoms of the victims were true, but there was never any gas. They all just suffered from mass hysteria that was created by the media. In the 1954 edition of the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, he described the mad gasser a shadowy representation of some unimaginable unknown. Scott Maruna, a high school teacher, believes that the mad gasser was actually Farley Quellen. He gives certain arguments to support his claim. Since Farley was a homosexual, an alcoholic, and a loner, Maruna believes that he fits perfectly into the role of the mad gasser. He was angry at the world for treating him different, and he desired revenge. He was the only man with the technical knowledge and the skill to concoct such a brew. He had a mobile lab, and explosions were heard coming from there at certain intervals. Maruna hypothesized that perhaps he was responsible for the first few gassings, and thanks to the press, mass hysteria and fear led to a couple more reports. He also pointed out that some people described similar assailants without having come in contact before. So many questions were raised by Maruna in his book, but with no evidence, the attacks could still be chalked up to hysteria. And although mass hysteria played a major part in creating the legend of the mad gasser, the possibility of a masked assailant could not be overlooked. Although Maruna's theories are controversial at best, and are based on circumstantial evidences that regard his sexual orientation as a major motive for his actions, his theory about Quellen being the gasser holds water. He could have formulated a two-phase plan and let the media do all the work for him. There's no denying that the gas must have truly existed for the townspeople to form their symptoms around, and several gases were suspected to be the instrument of the gasser's attacks, and none of them quite fit the description. Chloroform could cause paralysis, but that would lead to immediate death. Nitromethane did not fit the description, neither does carbon tetrachloride or any other gas for that matter. So perhaps the gas was some unknown substance that causes temporary paralysis. Over the years, there has been some interesting theories about how the mad gasser came to be. Some think he is a being from a different dimension. Others believe he is an ape-man, and for all we know, the mad gasser could be a figment of Mrs. Jones' imagination, or it could really be a man or woman armed with a strange gas pump, whose real purpose was never truly established.